Well, it's an honor to connect with you all. Thank you for your interest in this topic. I'm going to be painting a large, long-term picture based on this emerging word, the Anthropocene, also pronounced the Anthropocene, but because we say anthropogenic and anthropomorphic and anthropology, I tend to favor the pronunciation of Anthropocene, which in its origin means the interval of humans. So my topic is to delve into what I'm calling a crucial moment in Earth history. And my lens will be large, and I'm going to take you on a bit of a tour across time to cover this topic, beginning with an acknowledgement that as someone who was born in Africa, albeit a very easterly corner of Africa, at the top of the Suez Canal zone, my father was stationed in the Royal Air Force there. I am honored to be in your midst with the Leadership for Conservation Africa. I situate this slide to begin with because I want to acknowledge, as it says on the right-hand side, that I've twice had the chance to host at museums the rather phenomenal touring exhibition called Race, Are We So Different? Unusually titled for an exhibition because it's within a question. It's sort of asking the question, race, are we so different? And the answer, of course, is no, with 99.5% the same DNA, except that we seem to be culturally in the mood, sadly, of making often far too much difference over the similarities we actually share. And the first panel of that exhibition says, as it says on this slide, we are all out of Africa and have been moving and mixing ever since. So it's in that spirit, ladies and gentlemen, that I bring you some initial humor using a Dilbury cartoon. We are in a fortunate disconnect in the world between nature and culture, with what is often referred to as a nature deficit syndrome. And so here's the mum here saying to her son going down the front path, see, this is called the outdoors. And the bright spark holding his electronics says, oh, I've seen this level on my video games. And so we have this problem of detachment from nature, but let's see what we can do about it. My own experience has started me in 3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites when I was a geologist, as Yuan said before, moving into the leadership of nature and science museums. 2 in Canada, 1 in the Yukon Territory, and 1 in Alberta, and 1 in China. And it's fantastic to study the world in sites that are large in scale and are doing their best to preserve the natural process. But my main sort of background was to move from research into the world of museums. There's only relatively few geologists that have taken that leap, and fewer still that have, I think, done what I've done, which is, since I've left museums, to enter into the issue of the Earth-human system. But I'll come to that a bit later. These are the 4 institutions from the beginning to the most recent on this slide. And I won't repeat the details. The names of them, the countries of them, and the missions of them are on this slide. But I want to just point out, again, as Yuan said, that in the middle of this 4-museum journey, over 30 years, that I was lucky to be appointed or elected the president of the Geological Association of Canada on its 50th anniversary. And my presidential address, somewhat of a prescient message of what would lie ahead in my future, I spoke on the subject of the human journey and the evolving museum. Let me digress now to talk about what geology as a subject encompasses from left to right on this slide. So, and this is somewhat a recap of the journey I've been on over the last 50 years since I was at University of Sheffield, earning an honours BSc in geology. Pretty much then and into the 70s and even the early 80s, geology was very much a subject looking at the history of the Earth into the ancient times. We didn't think about humans. We didn't think about ice ages even hardly. But gradually, geology seemed to transition from being that word to a broader thinking earth science, in which the oceans, and more particularly what lay at the bottom of the oceans, and the sudden burst of understanding about plate tectonics and seafloor spreading with the ocean taken out of our view, that became crucial, because only then could we understand the nature and distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes, for example. But back into this time frame, in the 1970s, these two individuals, James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, started to bring us an understanding of what they called the Gaia hypothesis, that if we shouldn't just take a hard rock, ancient geological view, or even an ocean and continent view, we need to take in the atmosphere as well. And so what they sort of started to push, and it's now become very much at the forefront of thinking, as I'll explain, is that when we take the whole planet, and if I go to the right-hand set of panels, the atmosphere, down to the hydrosphere, into the cryosphere, the frozen sphere of ice sheets and glaciers, and the inset is the frozen soil, the tundra across North Asia and northern North America, up onto the biosphere, down into the humanosphere with its inset of the virosphere, which is the contained envelope of viral diseases, of which we've just been experiencing COVID-19, and down into the lithosphere with its crucial uppermost layer, the pedosphere, which is the soil sphere. So these days we need to see that it's not just the Earth system, but rather it's the Earth-human system. And I'll delve into this a bit more as I go on, but it's comprised at least of these 6 subsystems, which all interact one with the other. And it reminds me to say that although there's so much focus on climate change these days, my concern about that focus is that it so often eliminates from consideration the related connections with these other spheres, particularly, for example, with the warming of the atmosphere and the melting of ice and the raising of sea level, or the disruption of ecosystems from their natural state, which destabilizes the virosphere. So just to give you a taste of how the interconnectedness of the Earth system is really what we should be talking about. If I now digress to look at geological time, you know, in our lifetimes, we're used to talking in terms of what, seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, years, decades, 80 years, maybe, a century. Well, geologically, we don't, of course, it's structured in a similar way. We don't count time, although we can through radioactive minerals in rocks, but we divide time into a similar hierarchy of intervals, from periods, epochs, to periods, to eras, to eras, and to eons, from tens of thousands of years up into billions of years. And that stack of, that sort of a schematic stack in the middle takes us just on the last 570 million years, which is the Phanerozoic, which means the eon of evident life, starting actually, it says here, about 540 million years ago, which is only 12% of all of Earth history. And if we take the Anthropocene, which only started, well, we could talk about that in a minute, but let's say it starts in the last few thousand years, some would even say just the last 70 years since the mid-20th century, then we're talking about less than a geological nanosecond. I'm going to be talking in particular about the last 100 years, from 1950 to 2050, and here we are sort of 2/3 of the way through that time span. So let me now start this chronology and cite for you, maybe you've heard of this phenomenal German explorer, Alexander von Humboldt, who lived for 90 years across the late 1700s, early 1800s, but it was right at the turn of the century, around 1801, 1802, that he made this pioneering expedition, as you can see in the map, particularly going into northwestern South America. But he was a very wise and prescient individual, and it's his view, as summarized in this great paper in the journal Science, called Humboldt's Fusion of Science and Humanism in 2019. As you can see, he kind of figured out that the Anthropocene discussion, he didn't call it the Anthropocene, but he was talking about the fact that humanity and nature are deeply intertwined, and that nature would persist in the absence of humanity, but the humanity cannot exist without nature. That's going to be the key theme going forward in this presentation for you. So let's skip to the beginning of that time frame. And I recently acquired, maybe I'm holding this up in a way that you can see it on the Zoom, this little red book that was published in 1950, which contains 5 lectures that the renowned astronomer Fred Hoyle, a British astronomer that became Sir Fred Hoyle, gave to the BBC after the Second World War on the place of the Earth in the solar system and the solar system in the bigger world of outer space. But he said, and I have the chapter in this book that I just acquired as a secondhand copy, he very wisely said in 1950, but he would not know when this would take place, that once a photograph of the Earth taken from the outside is available, a new idea as powerful as any in history will be let loose. It's not quite true that it was the first photograph he was talking about. If we can say he talked about the first full planet color photograph, then that quote is accurate. But certainly there were things up in the sky circling and being shot out from the Earth before that, satellites and all, that were taking slivers of the Earth, but no full photograph was taken until, 22 years later on the Apollo 17, when, Apollo 8 gives us this Earthrise picture that's in the center of this slide. Apollo 11 and 69 gives us the landing on the moon, which some of us on this call will surely remember, I think. I'm not the only one, where Neil Armstrong said one big leap for man, one giant leap for mankind. And then we have and they didn't look at the Earth particularly from the moon. That photography was not a popular activity by NASA, incredibly, until the 1972 Apollo 17 mission, when they took high-quality photographic equipment, a Hasselblad camera to be precise, and halfway to the moon, about 130,000 miles towards the moon, they took this famous so-called blue marble shot. 1972 also was when the first Earth Day happened, and there's the front page of the New York Times. Millions joined Earth Day celebrations because we now had this appreciation that our place in space was kind of special, but also fragile, that wafer-thin atmosphere with the blue-green planets. So now I digress to the subject that is probably near to your heart, all of you, and that is we're having a bit of a conversation about conservation here. And for me, these 3 individuals, there are of course many, but I think we take a lot of wisdom out of Rachel Carson with her Silent Spring in the 60s. And I won't repeat these quotes here, but all of them were giving us a much larger view about what we should consider and respect about the larger world of nature around us. Jane Goodall, of course, with her beginning of her work in Gombe in East Africa, you'll be familiar with that, with this quote that humans, she felt back then, possess an innate tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. And then the recently deceased E.O. Wilson talking about how, in much more contemporary terms, that we have to do a much better job at illuminating the rest of nature. We're too much focused on me now and not enough about us future. So let's skip forward to the mid-80s, and we have the United Nations commissioning the several times Prime Minister of Norway, Madame Brundtland, to head up a commission on environment and development. It led to this book called Our Common Future, and in this book we find the original definition of sustainable development. Now, I pause to say this was probably a breakthrough, but when it was defined that sustainable development should be not using more today than we leave for future generations, I'm afraid metaphorically that was kind of dead on arrival as soon as it was said. We were already abusing the entitlements of future generations by starting to decimate the biosphere, polluting the atmosphere, and starting to put plastics into the environment and so on. And so this term stays with us, as I'll talk a bit later, with the world of UN Sustainable Development Goals, but I'm afraid it's a very challenged concept. Meanwhile, we skip forward to 2022, and Andy Revkin, who was a former science journalist with the New York Times, says in 2022, when he's now in the Earth Institute at Columbia University in New York City, he says that the term sustainability, perhaps you might agree, perhaps you don't, please let's talk about it in the Q&A period. He said it's one of the most overused and ill-defined words in conversations about the environment. Well, we skip forward to the Earth being talked about in Anthropocene terms. There was a paper in 2000 when Paul Crutzen, the Nobel laureate that told us about the ozone layer, actually had connected in 2000 in another paper, which more time I would reference, but he partnered with a limnologist, a lake expert from Denmark, Eugene Sturmer, to produce this concept of the Anthropocene. And that you see in the inset against him. He also passed away early last year. He was living in Germany at the Max Planck Institute, was his workplace, but he published this one-page paper in Nature called The Geology of Mankind. It's probably been one of the most cited papers in Nature ever because of the popularity of the term Anthropocene, which he coined, or he did with his colleague 2 years before. I just take 4 quotes out of this paper, although if you're an Anthropocene stratigrapher, you will not be picking these quotes out. You'll talk about his mention of the Anthropocene, in their view, becoming an epoch in the Earth geological timescale, which is not my view, as I'll come on to say. But so what I want to highlight is that he recognized now humans will remain a major environmental force, that we, collectively, we have a daunting task, we scientists and engineers, to guide society. Well, I'd ask you just metaphorically or rhetorically, how many scientists and societies consider it their job to guide society? That we need, that he said, Paul Crutzen, to have appropriate human behavior at all scales, locally, provincially, nationally, and globally. And that's also a problem with the Sustainable Development Goals. And that he recognized that we're still living largely on terra incognita, life, land unknown. So those kind of were prescient statements. And so we come forward to 2014, when this non-biologist, this writer for the New Yorker, as is increasingly common, that major breakthroughs in understanding about the Earth-human system are coming not into public view from scientists, but by interested, quote, lay people. Elizabeth Kolbert wrote this book called The Sixth Extinction, subtitle An Unnatural History. And it was in the same year that the New York Times printed this wonderful graphic. It's probably, these percentages have all gotten higher now. Those are the percentages of threatened birds, mammals, and amphibia, as you can see. And we already had this serious situation that we were in the midst of this 6th mass extinction, the previous 5 being all naturally caused. And we're on the legacy of all of those, but we're producing in rapid time, geologically speaking, the 6th extinction due to ecosystem disruption, over harnessing of land animals and life under the sea, pollution, hunting, and not living within quotas, certainly not living sustainably. So for me, I want to just then skip forward to the joint declaration in 2015, when the Lancet Journal, the oldest medical journal in the world, partnered with the New York City-based Rockefeller Foundation to look at the issue of planetary health. And they concluded, as it says here, that the health of the planet equals the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which each depends. So it's going back to that earlier nature and humanity vision that the German explorer Alexander von Humboldt had. These images on the right, I had the good fortune in 2018 to travel with some 30 other cultural leaders to visit the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala in India. And each of us was asked to prepare sort of a brief presentation. And mine was on the right, or at least an element of mine was on the right-hand side, that we're used to empathy being a human-to-human construct, and that's an image from the Race Are We So Different exhibition, by the way. But looking into the eye of an elephant, which we've decimated so extensively through ivory and habitat loss and hunting, we need to have empathy on the human to non-human scale with equal veracity, in my view, to the human-to-human empathy. But more broadly, all of life and its connection and interdependency with the environment and habitats also needs to be in our empathetic view. So we come now to the last 5 or 7 years. There's the cover of the famous 2030 Transforming Our World Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. And here's a quote from it, which seems now 7, 8 years later to be very, very idealistic. So I need to quote this. It was called Transforming Our World, which sounds very certain, doesn't it? But they said, we resolve between now and 2030, and we're now at the halfway stage, right? 2023. We resolve to end poverty and hunger everywhere. Well, that hasn't happened. To combat inequalities within and between countries. That hasn't happened. To build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. Well, great efforts are being made about that, but clearly we haven't won that game either. And to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. That journey continues, and I've underlined, because this talk is about the natural world, to ensure the lasting protection of the planet. Well, I'm afraid we've failed rather miserably about that. So that's the sort of starting point for the last part of this talk. And here, if you're not familiar with this, this is this rather famous graphic of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Notice how they start with cultural issues, poverty, hunger, health, education, equality, and then they move down in the bottom row to climate and life underwater and life on land. And then we sort of have some umbrella goals at the end. Each of these is a focus of national, international efforts. And just last Thursday, a week ago, I was on a stakeholder forum as a panelist for Life on Land, which I don't have time to get into now, other than I'm going to allude to a couple of things I said. The year after those were promulgated, the world actually doesn't know about them very much, and that's still a problem. We don't have a world aware of the only plan the world has. But in 2016, this gentleman who was then at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada, who's now in British Columbia, wrote this paper called The Anthropocene, the Good, Bad, and Ugly. But he did say, and it's still a very germane quote, that the Anthropocene, he said, and it applies today just as much, is a key theme in contemporary speculations about the meaning of the present and the possibilities for the future. How the Anthropocene is interpreted and who gets to invoke which framing of the new human age matters greatly for both the planet and for particular parts of humanity. The particular parts, as you might expect, are those that live at subsistence levels and for whom the issue of culture-nature balances are a luxury that they can't even concern themselves with, given that they are trying to stay alive themselves. Skip forward to 3 years ago, and we have now the newly formed International Science Council, the uppermost body of the social and natural sciences in the world, which in its 2020 report, global launch of a human development report titled The Next Frontier, they start to talk about the Anthropocene with this quote, that for the first time in a relationship spanning 300,000 years, that's 300,000 years of the 4.65 billion years in Earth history, that's the last second or so of Earth history, instead of the planet shaping humans, humans are shaping the planet. this, they announced, is the Anthropocene, the age of humans. That's a very accurate statement, except now we're debating, dickering, I was going to say, between various factions of sciences about exactly what should be the definition of the Anthropocene. The incoming vice president, or the incoming president of the ISC, Motoko Kitani, a mathematician from Japan, has said in a blog last year, just before the COP27 meeting, that the great challenge, he said, is now for basic science and society to transcend the Earth barriers and to co-create a new vision of the Earth-human system in an integrated manner. That's correct. Well, I said earlier when I was showing you those 6 sort of thumbnails of the 6 subsystems of the Earth system, that the hydrosphere and the atmosphere are pretty connected. Well, in the 20,000, I think the 2000 issue of the journal Anthropocene, Innovation in the Human Age, Elizabeth Rush writes, like it or not, retreat from the coast has begun. And, you know, there's a whole chunk of humanity that lives very close to sea level on low-lying coasts or next to precarious cliffs, which are being eroded by storm waves and extreme weather. And so there's a picture of New York, which needs to move its boundary in. And right now, they're trying to discuss whether to surround New York City, Manhattan with a seawall, like Singapore, which is a little controversial, or to simply get out of the way and relocate, to retreat from the coast. These are thorny, wicked problems, to use that term, that nobody really has any solution for. So let's skip forward to just 6 weeks ago, and the UN General Assembly is now focused on the midpoint of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and they're now announcing that it's time for a rescue plan for people and planet. It's time to sound the alarm. And so this is alarming that, as it says in that white print, approximately 140 targets that have data show only about 12% are on track, 12%. Close to half, although showing some progress, are moderately or severely off track. And a third of the goals either have seen no movement or regressed below their foundation level in 2015. And so the quote that I'm pulling out in red, if ever there was an illumination of the short-sightedness of our prevailing economic and political systems, it is the ratcheting up on the war on nature. I think we might all agree with that, of the leadership for conservation in Africa. And so I published twice. I've been publishing now about the Anthropocene for 12 years, starting in 2011 in the Geoscientist, the magazine of the Geological Society of London. And in that paper, I said, and it was a little ahead of its time, I said, as it says here, that I thought that geology uniquely brings big time and space perspectives to the planning table as an essential frame of reference. I said that the Anthropocene represents geology's best chance to take its rightful place as a core contributor to the harmonious, multidisciplinary pursuit of positive consequences in the world. I have to acknowledge the giant philosopher Aristotle, who 3,000 years ago gave me this, a part of this language. Aristotle said that the role of leadership 3,000 years ago is to pursue the harmonious pursuit of positive consequences in the world. I don't think we're very good at doing that still. And then just last year, with colleagues from Cambridge University and University College London, in the journal Episodes of the International Union of Geological Sciences, we said, today it does not seem premature to conclude that the Anthropocene, with all that this term can usefully encompass, looms as the most consequential alteration. And I've got something covering the remaining part of that slide, but you'll see what I mean. So my colleague Phil Gibbard and others have printed this diagram, which is on a time frame from, let's see if I can just use my pointer here for a second. There we are. So there's, let me go forward one slide. So there's 1 million years ago, and here's 100 years ago. And this is the Ice Age that has long been called the Pleistocene Epoch. And here's the Holocene Epoch, which we're currently living in, about 11,000 years ago, the post-Ice Age. There's a few other annotations here. but you can see that the thinking about the Anthropocene is not an epoch in the view that I have and others have, but rather as an event that corresponds to human evolution and the historical timeline that lies below. There are some labels there, which again, I don't have time to get into, but the big conversation is whether the Anthropocene is an event, let me go back, or an epoch, and I'll come to that in the next slide. But this thinking is surrounded, and now I think I have 3 slides to the end, by this term existential crisis, which we seem to be surrounded with. It's sort of falling into sentences and news reports pretty often these days. But roll the clock back before 2019, the only way that people heard about existential crisis was at very much an individual level. If an individual felt that she was in a moment of deep questioning about themselves and their place in the world, they maybe went to a mental health practitioner and the diagnosis was that you were having an existential crisis. That's the individual. They couldn't figure out where they fit. But then at the beginning of 2019, with pandemics and autocratic regimes and climate change and so on, we suddenly have the term applying globally. And the term, and dictionary.com put the term as their word of the year, existential, to refer to accelerating or sudden, preoccupying and news-dominating issues that destabilize social and or environmental norms. So that's where we are now. And the other mindset that we need to bring into play, surely, and particularly I should say this, since we are all out of Africa and we've been moving and mixing ever since, is to respectfully understand that the right kind of thinking has been around for a long time with indigenous people. And I use the examples of the North American Iroquois and Dakota nations that are celebrants of the notion that we should all be good ancestors. Think about a multi-generation mindset. Those that have been before, our great-grandparents, our grandparents, our parents, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and be sort of proponents of thinking in a one-world interdependent way, being sort of a proactive citizen that thinks catalytically about the relationship with everything else, the connection between nature and culture, that Aristotelian phrase of harmonious pursuit of positive consequences. This is some terminology from the Long Now Foundation in in California, the notion of now, that is like last month, right now, next month, nowadays, last year, this year, next year, and 10,000 years ago to 10,000 years into the future, which was the time frame on that previous slide. And that they, in these cultures, are comfortable, as we so often in the world today are not, to both embrace when it's appropriate stability, but also to embrace change, which we don't have enough of going on. And so I already prefaced this slide by saying the Anthropocene this year is in 2 states of possibility. The one that an Anthropocene working group is a proponent of, that actually uses, in my view, very terribly, the mid-20th century testing of atomic bombs in the US and in Russia and other countries, which gives us sort of a layer of plutonium-rich sediment everywhere around the world that can be recognized to date the epoch. That's nice, but it's the wrong thing to do. It's unethical in my view, particularly with the upcoming release of the film on Oppenheimer, at least at the end of this month in North America. I am a fan, as is Phil Gibbard and others that I've written with, that we need to have the Anthropocene be instead a shorthand term, a transdisciplinary term for the post-Ice Age events and impacts, and that recognizing that humanity has detached itself extensively from the natural functioning of the planet and continues to do so. So I end with 2 quotes that have really started to broaden the emphasis of the Anthropocene. This professor at Oxford University, Yadvinder Mahili, in Geography and Environment, and I agree with him, and these words are going to appear in my next paper in progress. He wrote in, 6 years ago, quite correctly, irrespective of the process of formalization, which I just spoke about, the Anthropocene has spilled out of its natural sciences origins to become a cultural zeitgeist, a catalyst for numerous cultural, philosophical, and political debates about how to understand and respond to human domination of the earth. And the second quote for you is from the head, a historian at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, Jürgen Wren, who last year said, in our period, the grand challenges are encountered in their aftermath. They no longer concern the local fate of city-states, but all of global society under the conditions of the Anthropocene. We can no longer categorically segregate culture from nature, but must face the fact that these spheres are inescapably mingled. I say to that, so be it. And so now we're at this crucial point in the UN schedule. You know, we look back at the 1972 Rio Summit, Environment and Development. The UN sort of announced it was pursuing a common agenda. It had a big, I attended a meeting this morning that's reviewing progress towards not the summit that's listed below, which is in September the 23rd, 24th in 2024, but this coming September, the 18th and 19th, there's an SDG summit to take stock of where we've gone and where we haven't gone. I don't think it's going to be a very good news meeting. And finally, the public may start en masse to realize we at Mission Control have a problem, just to sort of use the pun from Apollo missions. So my view, my lens is to go out to 2050 and to think that the Anthropocene can nourish a sense of renaissance, not the renaissance we think of from Middle Ages or the Islamic Renaissance, but a new renaissance that integrates nature and culture, that sort of looks holistically at the past, the present, and the future, takes a holistic look at environments and societies, and sort of blends, finally, but I'm optimistic, or maybe I'm pessimistic, the sciences and the humanities. We're working too much as silos. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you, and I would welcome all of your questions and your follow-up contact with me. My email address is simply costa.emlyn@gmail.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn. So I'll stop sharing, and I look forward to interacting with you. You mentioned, Ruan, Charles Lyle, and I might have just included a short 8-word quote from him. You know, in 1785, and he lived on the coast of Scotland, he looked at rocks exposed on the shoreline, and he said to an earth that was very undisturbed by humans, he said, "I can see no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end," which I think is a very prophetic phrase to describe what we don't have now, because we're mucking around with natural processes.
Precisely. So thank you very much. And then, well, I think it was only Andrew that gave you an applause, but that's all good. Let's open the screen for questions and answers. So we can start. Andrew, your name's and hand is up first. You can unmute, please, and then fire away, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruan. Dr. Emlyn, very, very informative discussion and presentation. My question is just that there is COP28 coming in Dubai. And I guess what you have presented now, Anthropocene, will have effect in some of the discussions there. I mean, yesterday we learned about a heat wave that was happening in America, you know. And to be honest, the COP issue has not been delivered. There's been a problem the whole world about, well, COP27, they promised from Egypt, now we're going to Dubai. what is happening? I'm not accusing you. Are you going to have an effect? Are you going to have impact? Are you going to assist the world into what is called the COP situation, you know?
Right. Well, of course, the COP acronym stands for Conference of the Parties, which maybe should suggest that we ought to be smarter at a collective view. You know, you posed the very fundamental question of whether we have reason to be optimistic that the COP series of meetings, going to number 28 now, and all of the other international meetings like the Biodiversity Summit that just happened in Montreal, and all of the others that are occurring all of the time.
Do they work?
Right.
I mean, really? I mean,
Yeah.
are we spending countries' monies? What is it that these organizations are saying to us? You know, what is it?
Well, I think that you know, I didn't. I showed you a picture of course, that wonderful Swedish youth activist Greta Thunberg, who says that there are no leaders in the room. You know, I as much as it's to be applauded that thank goodness the United Nations back you know, a decade ago thought that it was high time for the world to have at least an attempted plan. I mean, it's the only plan the world has, but of course it contains faults, and I think that they're beginning to realize that now that we're at the midpoint and things aren't going very well. I would say, and I said a few hours ago in the chat to a status report of the Sustainable Development Goals, that I said that you know, it's currently popular to blame the COVID and other world crises for our lack of progress with the SDGs. I respectfully don't agree that we can blame those things for our lack of progress. What we need to confront candidly is that we had a faulty idea back in 2015 that if we just divvied up the world's dynamism into 17 siloed sustainable development goals, and if we succeeded with all the targets, that we'd have enough progress. I'm afraid that even if we today were celebrating perfect achievement of all 17 goals, there will be so many gaps between each goal that we haven't taken a holistic look at the whole planet in the way that I'm recommending. So that my short answer is, I think until we have this global view, which I'm now trying to work on in terms of advocacy to the UN, now that I've inserted myself into some network of the UN at a low level, but I've got contacts now. I'm hoping to sort of parlay up this kind of thinking, and so we'll see.
Okay, are you going to be there at the COP28?
I'm not going to be there, no, but I'm following everything online. I've never Zoomed so much in my life before, but I'll follow it with great interest. But thanks for your question.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Let's go to Peter. Peter, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thanks, everyone. That was a great talk. I'm really interested in this topic, and I'm glad you brought up the issue about the Anthropocene not being an epoch, and I know that the working group, the Anthropocene working group, there's this big disparity between the I don't know the complete term for the geologists that say, look, this is just an event, and the social scientists saying, on the other hand, that it should be an epoch. But and they decided on this, I think it was in September 2021, and they didn't come to an agreement. So technically we're not in the Anthropocene as an epoch, but I do think that the Anthropocene is a good philosophical term to say, gee, we really need to do something about where we are. But I'd like your thoughts about possibly we are the world socio-economic political environment is driving everything, and in a way it's unstoppable. And I think by framing the biodiversity crisis as a crisis and the climate crisis as a crisis possibly is the wrong way about doing this. All the people, and you had Greta Thunberg on the thing, they're saying the end of the world is near, but all the prophecies of the planet and the future have been totally way off and wrong. So I don't know, I'd like to hear your thoughts about whether we're framing this whole crisis thing correctly.
Well, thank you. You do survey the status of these terms, but let me give you one update. It's still, and I regret that a few slides ago I didn't take you across what were a series of icons across the top of the slide, which I was going to just explain the protocol by which this term Anthropocene is going to be defined. Right now, as you've alluded to, there is a working group that's actually been at work since 2009, and in 2019 they almost reached sort of a conclusion before they gathered the evidence that the Anthropocene should start with the residue of atomic bomb testing in the mid-20th century, and that should demarcate the base of the Anthropocene. They're on that so intensively, and the first stage of decision making is a recommendation which they're about to make, that the Anthropocene be an epoch that starts in the mid-20th century. But that's not the end of it. It then goes to 3 other layers of review and approval, and it's by no means a done deed that the term is going to come out at the end having been approved, and no approval means no term. Meanwhile, you've had my colleague Phil Gibbard at the University of Cambridge, and I've joined him on this, as have many others, proposing that this sort of stratigraphic technicality is actually not useful, and what we need to do is talk about the science of the recent history of the planet in a way which we can cause the public to grasp. You know, we as a world public don't really even understand our own evolution. I'm sure you do this better in Africa than we do in North America, given the genesis of humanity in Africa. But you know, there's a lot of detracting talk, shall I say, in cultures around the world that don't allow people to understand their natural origins. And if we don't understand our own natural origins, then we can't understand adequately the natural place we have in the scheme of things. So I'm hoping that the event and the Renaissance idea that I've been promoting, that we need a holistic sort of A to Z approach, not crisis driven, you're quite correct, but rather sort of constructively, holistically going about a renaissance, a fresh look. We don't have much time, but a fresh look to sort of rethink where we are, in what context, and to not bang people over the head with science says, but rather to explain what we know, what we don't know, and what we're doing about it.
Apologies, Peter. You can unmute yourself again. Any comments on Emlyn's answer?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree. But a thing that that I keep thinking about is the Holocene has provided us with a climate for humans to excel. And so over the last 10,000 odd years, we've moved from basically hunters and gatherers to huge complex environments that we live in now. But our climate is changing. Whether we're helping it on or not is part of the debate. But it is plausible that the climate's going to change where humans, and if we listen to Yuval Harari, where we'll get AI that will take over, and so humans will evolve into something different. If we put that argument aside, and we get to a point in the planetary environment where the climate is no longer suitable for us to exist. And within a few million years, we are part of that event in the sediment of the world that is represented by a few meters of debris.
Well, you take the time frame way out there, and there are, yes, we got to kind of go there. Maybe going out a million years, going out 100 years is even challenging to most people. Going out a few tens of years is challenging to most people. Of course, the UN is currently only looking to 2030, and they're going to have to confront in the next few years, as the deadline for Agenda 2030 comes to a close, what is going to be the next stage of planning. Again, I'm hoping that the kind of thing I've been just discussing in response to your previous question starts to take hold. We're already confusing the sort of the time issue by, and sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I was going to take the answer another direction. So I'll pause because I've just lost what I was going to say there in terms of a train of thought. Let me come back to you, Yuan.
Lovely. Thank you, Peter. I'm going to move on to Clive Hollock. Clive, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and then you can ask your question.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Emlyn, thank you very much for that very interesting topic. And it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking over, because I'm fortunate enough to work with Bushmen. And some of the Bushmen that I work with actually didn't know much about the modern world until the last 15 or 20 years. So I've had some insight into the mind of humans as they were thousands of years back. So there are two questions. One that often bugs me, and that one of the things that the Bushmen say is that God did not make mistakes. Everything is done for a purpose. So I start thinking, well, number one, what is the human purpose? That is the one. What is our contribution to this planet? What do you think it might be? I know it's a big question. And then the second one is, having worked with these Bushmen and seeing that these people were not born, and maybe humans were not born and innately anthropocentric. Do you think that the way we are today is an evolutionary process, or is it something due to psychological conditioning to actually benefit the economic system that we have to live with today?
Well, big questions. I'm inclined to just begin as briefly as I can with the answer, to say that when I first went to Australia and went to see an exhibition in Tasmania called Katamakara, which I guess is Dreamtime in Aboriginal Australian, which was astounding to me, because I hadn't appreciated, as this exhibition could explain to me, that the passing down of memory generation to generation over not just hundreds, but thousands of years, that elders of elders are telling their offspring about animals that the elders saw, which had long gone extinct. I found that incredible, that the human memory could project, that sort of multi-generational view back to when animals have already gone extinct. And so I would say that, without getting religious, that I find, as an evolutionist, as a geologist, that I can see an entirely natural progression of human origins and of human development. So I'll just pinpoint a couple of things. I think that, it's pretty well known anthropologically, archaeologically, that when we, our ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, became a little fascinated with what happens when one of us dies, or when one of us is born, they started to sort of realize that there was some kind of repeating process across lifetimes, from birth to life to death. And then rituals started to happen, communities started to happen, organizations started to happen. And I remember being told a story by one of the professors who was studying at Olduvai Gorge, when he had some students there on a field excursion, and he gave them a sharpened blade from a stone tool, and gave them one deer, and said, see if you can take the skin off this deer, and one person with one blade cannot do that. But he said, now form a partnership, and the other person that came up stretched the legs apart to the point where it was easy to break into the skin because you are now stretching the skin, but that required cooperation. And so I feel that there's a very logical and explainable, but barely and often not understood rational sequence of developments that has been exponential and which has caused humans who initially were part and parcel, human life evolved out of wildlife, but it seemed like with agriculture and with trading and with industry and exploitation of Earth's resources that we started to, screw things up and take more than our fair share. And now we're living the consequences of being the predominant species on the planet and putting the rest of life in some degree of jeopardy.
Thank you, Emlyn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clive. And then we're going to move to our dear colleague, Holly, and the class from Aplori all the way in Nigeria.
Great to see a class. Lovely.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's
where are they located?
It's in Nigeria. I'm not exactly sure where in the country.
Okay. Hello, welcome.
Please, I would like to ask, what makes Anthropocene a valid concept? Or
what
it won't be, what makes Anthropocene a valid concept? That it won't be, as usual, one of the geological timeline concept that we've heard previously, like the Holocene.
Right, but it's a great question. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And the second question, can you highlight some of the mitigation and adaptation of dealing with this twin crisis, that is climate change and global warming, either at the local or regional level?
Well, the first question, first, the Anthropocene has been introduced as a concept. What's problematic is that the papers back in 2000, 2002 by Sturmer and Crutzen that I highlighted, maybe in hindsight made a mistake by naming what they felt was something which should be recognized, which was the extent of human disruption of the surface of the planet and of its sedimentary record, by calling it an epoch sounding word. So we have, as you may know, in the tertiary period, we have the Miocene, Pliocene, Oligocene, and so on, and then the Pleistocene, and so the Holocene fits that. The word scene, C-E-N-E, is Latin, I believe, for interval. But by calling now the Anthropocene, anthro was correct, anthro meaning to do with humans and sentient beings, but the addition of scene maybe made it sound too much like we'd already figured out that it should be an epoch. And I don't think it should be. And I don't think that's going to be the ultimate result of the current debate on the definition. I think the term's not going to go away. We're here to stay with Anthropocene. But I think it's going to mean increasingly, in my vision, not an epoch with a sharp boundary, but rather as shorthand, transdisciplinary shorthand, as I said, for really the ongoing and long-lasting and a continuous sort of gradual and then accelerating evolution, both initially biological and morphological, but now attitudinal evolution of the human species. That's how I would define it. In terms of, what are the differences between Holocene and Anthropocene, if that was your second question, and it goes back to the previous question a little bit, which is the bit I couldn't remember. We're already knowingly, it seems, we're mucking up climate to the point where the natural cyclicity of ice age and non-ice age climates, called the Milankovitch cycle, we seem to have warmed the atmosphere by 1 or 2 degrees centigrade enough that we've stopped the cooling that might have led to the next glacial. So that's already happened, it seems, in some people's views. And now, of course, we're warming the climate, which was the other part I didn't remember earlier, to the point where we're shifting the temperature-controlled latitudinal arrangement of ecosystems on the planet, and that's why in Central America, there's the crops that are have been grown on mountainsides. They're now so dry and hot that they can't grow what traditionally grew in those locations, and so now they're having to migrate to lower, cooler altitudes. I think this climate change is happening, and it's happening very fast. And the problem we have is that we're now having to separate extreme weather from climate change, and those are complicated things to pull apart.
Wonderful, thank you. Any more questions from our team?
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. I have a question.
Please introduce yourself before you ask your question. It would be nice to have a name that we can fix to the question.
Right. Thank you. My name is Henry.
Hello.
Master student at Lowry. Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. I think making my submission, I would like to say that now we have a common place to argue connections with nature, which is needed to mobilize support for both conservation, biodiversity, and environment generally. So this is my question. Sir, you made mention of nature deficit syndrome. And looking at the nature deficit syndrome, would I be right to say that technology has replaced the attitude of this nature deficient? And if technology is playing a big role, I'm wondering, with the rapid development of technology, going forward, aren't we at the verge of more devastation, looking at the unsustainable use of technology? So this is my question, sir.
Thank you. So the way I want to answer that is that, initially when this concept of nature deficit syndrome was introduced in a book by the same name, my understanding was that, this was much earlier, relatively speaking, to the advent of handheld technology and so on. And really, what we were seeing in that generation 2 or 3 decades ago was a disturbing tendency that children didn't go outdoors anymore. Parents didn't regard it as safe to let their kids go out on a bike into the woodlands, down to the pond, down to a river edge. Clearly there are safety issues, but certainly that's what got me into nature when I was growing up on the south coast of England, was going down to a local pond and catching amphibia, and going to the coast and between storms, of course, and pottering around and finding fossils and shells and so on. So I think that the first problem we had is that we didn't feel safe as parents, as my parents felt, to be able to just let us go out on our bikes and go down to nature places and understand and have animals, as pets and things like that. And so, but I think what we're now dealing with, and it's the cartoon that I showed at the beginning of my talk, is that, the boy in that cartoon, he knows about nature. He can see it, on his handheld, on his games and his this, that, and the other technology that, has left me far behind in terms of all of its modern loops. So I feel that we have 2 problems. They built one on the other. We have nature deficit syndrome as a result of disinterest or fear or hesitation or discouragement to go outside and get to know nature up front and personal. And then we have the compounding problem that children spend too much time, and children of all ages, may I say, spend too much time looking at their screens and not understanding, not stopping in nature to listen to the birds sing and the changing of the seasons and that sort of thing. That would be my answer to your question, briefly.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you.
Good evening. So one more question from our floor. One more.
Okay.
My name is Joan Banda, and my question is in reference to the part of the slide where you mentioned how as humans in general, we keep setting these targets for ourselves, and we keep failing each and every time we set them in terms of biodiversity conservation. So it seems to me that there's other forces at play, and one such force I would like to think is politics. So my question is, are we as conservationists playing the politics game in order to favor our side, and if so, how are we doing that?
Well, I'm a little bit outside of my knowledge sphere, so I don't want to give you an answer that presumes for 1 minute that I know what I should to answer this question about the practice of conservation. I will only very briefly say, if I may, that I think the world needs the conservation ethos more than ever before. Because it goes back to the heart of what maybe sustainability meant in the first place, which is, conserving, keeping, maintaining a level of resource that we're not compromising the entitlement of those that come after us. So fishing quotas, not farming more land than we can afford to put, under, not paving over more land than we can afford to do for the crops we need to grow, not overfishing beyond fish stocks. Growing up or spending 25 years in Canada and learning in England that off the coast of Newfoundland, on the east coast of Canada, cod, the fish cod, was so bountiful that you could literally just drop a net over the side and catch them so easily. They were so abundant. And then suddenly, within a decade or so, all the fisheries had to stop catching cod because they had overfished the stock, and then it gradually came back to a sustainable quantity. That's where the word sustainability maybe has a truthful definition. So I think I can't take the answer to your great question more than simply saying, I think that it's the responsibility of those who are very knowledgeable in conservation biology to be able to manage this. I will give you one other example that I gave to the UN last week. When I was at a Jackson Hole Wildlife Film Festival several years ago, there was a great film on the building of roads through tropical rainforests. And what I was so impressed by is that rather than slashing, channels through the forest such that the wildlife on one side could not communicate comfortably with the wildlife on the other side, so they were breaking up the ecosystem, is that they purposely left trees that were very tall in their canopies intact, so that the canopy life could actually continue to jump across from treetop to treetop. And they actually monitored that the arboreal canopy wildlife was actually relatively unscathed, and they were able to, it's a funny impression, but imagine, apes leaping across the tops of logging roads and being able to still do their thing to keep the ecosystem intact. That's what I learned is progressive practice in terms of selective logging. Maybe more of you know about that. That would be an illustration to what the kind of thing we need to do going forward. More of that kind of attitude.
So I'm going to come in there, and then I have a question for you. But first, I'm going to come back to say last year I was at the APAC, Africa Protected Areas Conference in Kigali, and they spoke about this linear infrastructure effect on conservation and wildlife. And it was very clear. It was a beautiful presentation. We had at least 15 politicians in the room. Not one has acted upon it. Everyone has decided on new roads and new electricity things through protected areas. But putting that aside, my question to you is, if we're going to deal with this crisis that is coming, we can't deal with it just by having a conservationist ideal. We need to deal with it, in my view, by either dealing with wealth distribution or with poverty. Which one do you think would have the most effect on the upcoming crisis?
I don't wish to sound trite, and thank you again for a fantastic question. I surely think that I will venture to suggest the only feasible answer is we need to work at it from both ends as rapidly as possible. We need to uplift the rights and opportunities of those that are, quote, poor, and educate those, quote, who are rich. I think that when the concept called the triple bottom line was invented, maybe you've heard of this, some of you, back about 2 decades ago, that the only viable or feasible, or even, may I say, sustainable solution to any decision about what to do was to give equal regard to 3 bottom lines: people, planet, and profit. We need money in order to invest in the business or even in the non-profit to be able to do more good work, but we can't just spend the money without having a empathy for the planet and for the people. And so I'll sort of circle that back around to your question, if I may, and say that overdue, and we have SDGs in the Sustainable Development Plan that deal with both ends of this, but like your example that you just cited, I'm afraid it's not happening. And so we're back to people like Greta Thunberg, who says, where are the leaders in the room?
True. All good, Holly? Just wave if you're fine. Lovely. Thank you very much. I'll move to Peter again.
Yeah. Just to answer the question, or to contribute to the answering the question of the lady from Nigeria, is I only see, when we talk conservation, we kind of talk parallel to everybody, to the economy and to politics and so on. The only way we're going to really benefit or get the conservation idea across, if we mainstream it, becomes part of the economies of the countries that we live in. Wildlife has a value, and we need to use that value. I know lots of people, especially Western thinking, think that wildlife shouldn't have a value. It has. It always has had a value, and so we have to build on what is being popularly called the wildlife economy. If you want to read more about that, go to ALU, which is the African Leadership University in Kigali, where Dr. Sue Snyman has been doing good work on that. So I think that's what we have to do. We have to mainstream conservation and conservation thinking, and give value of wildlife to people, especially people on the ground that have nothing. But what I really wanted to say was, when we were talking earlier on about the Anthropocene and why it should be called why it should be an epoch, there is a very nice YouTube clip, and there are quite a few actually, but where the 2 proponents for the Anthropocene is proposed. So anybody, you can just go and Google the YouTube channel for the Anthropocene, and you'll get quite a few. I think it's a TED talk where the 2 proponents, and I can't remember their names, give you a good breakdown on why they want to call it an epoch and not an event like I think it should be called.
Well, the proponents of the epoch, in my view, are thinking only in very classic geological timescale stratigraphic views. There's 2 things wrong with it. I think one is it's not taking advantage of this unique overdue opportunity that we have to draw the public's attention to the human species as an evolved, troubled contributor to life on Earth. And secondly, by picking the mid-20th century and relying on along with other sedimentary proxies, as they're called, but particularly tying it to the leftovers, the chemical radionuclide leftovers of the atomic bomb testing, we are keeping into the public's attention the most heinous invention ever made by humanity. And I'm thinking that the upcoming release of the autobiographical film on Oppenheimer, the principal of the Manhattan Project, is going to, for a very bad reason, but very usefully, ironically, is going to remind people of just how awful this is and how we must do everything possible not to keep this kind of terminology alive.
Very true. Thank you very much, Emlyn and Peter, for your question. Let's ask Stephen. Stephen, you can unmute and the screen's yours.
Thanks very much. And thank you very much for the insightful talk as well. My comment really is just to add on to comments by Peter Mills as well. Certainly lots of great work being done by Sue Sneyman in Rwanda. She'd sent me a video last week, a talk by Fred Swanica, and he discussed in his talk a lot of the the paradigm shift that the world currently needs to take on, and that is, his particular talk was a new approach to education and finding sustainable ways to fund education and address the lack of accessibility for education for many people around the world, and certainly promoting a new paradigm shift in how we look at African solutions and a lot of empowering the youth, because I think that's where many of the solutions lies, is with the youth in trying to find solutions to these challenges that we face in our lifetime. Other positive initiatives that I thought was quite beneficial was the Earthshot Prize, which has been headed by many celebrities and Prince William in particular, and how they providing a platform and incentive and initiative for many low scale young entrepreneurs seeking solutions to climate change problems, air pollution, water pollution, and so on. But also acknowledging countries who are they adopting sustainable practices. Costa Rica is one of them. There are great initiatives going on in those countries, and acknowledging the politicians who are involved and who are taking a step up to solving these problems. So another one was the Sustainable Markets Initiative that they've launched recently, which is getting industries on board. You're talking massive airline industries, sustainable energy, and so forth. So there certainly is a lot being done in various sectors, but it's everyone doing what they can do within their sphere of influence.
Indeed, indeed. Great examples.
Yeah, just a comment, no question, but thank you very much. It's certainly a very valuable and lots of food for thought.
Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you. Marty, yeah, well, you can unmute yourself, so there you go.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emlyn. And, I think I've waited to sort of ask the question because it's sort of developed as we've been going on, but it kind of comes back to some of the first comments, almost the perceived failure of all the efforts that have been made in actually making a difference. And I'm kind of thinking that these things will only become real when every single person at their level, living in their own home, know practically the tacky hits the tarmac, what they need to do to turn this around. I don't know if that's kind of helpful, because I think a lot of the stuff is happening intellectually and philosophically and in lots of meetings and drawing up policies, but until grassroots, every citizen of the planet appreciate that it's not going to have material effects. And I'm not sure, you kind of get the sense that it's very much, I think the reality is that there's a cost associated with being sustainable, whether you are not taking advantage of something, so therefore you losing an opportunity or whatever. And it's actually everybody needing to appreciate it and acknowledge that there's a cost that or something that is going to cost society. And until everyone is forced to do that, and I hate using the word forced, but I don't know, you almost need to win people's hearts over, which becomes self-regulatory. I'm not too sure if you've got any sort of comment on all the jarble I'm saying.
These questions, which I'm very grateful, have encouraged me to share a thought that I'm actually putting in front of my colleagues at the UN. And so I'm going to take advantage of your enthusiasm to put this out there and invite reaction. You know, we're heading towards the end of this decade where we're going to put another rocket up into space and put astronauts on the moon again. The Artemis mission is now heading towards its final plans. They intend to land astronauts on the moon in 2029. I am not saying this, please understand, because I think we should inhabit other planets or moons. Absolutely not. But what I am saying this for, and the reason I'm raising it with the UN, and this is the point I'd love any reactions to, is that if those of us who are old enough to remember Apollo to the moon in July '69 will know that 600 million people watched the landing on the moon, and that was a fifth of humanity at that time. There's nothing else we could do that could generate such a live audience. So imagine if on the way to the moon, or in the briefing before the mission, or on the lunar surface, or on the way back, or in the post-mission briefing, that the Secretary General of the United Nations, whoever he or she may be at that point, has talked to the administrator of NASA and has suggested that this opportunity must be taken full advantage of to communicate when we're up there and we see the planet from a distance, what the astronauts call the overview effect, that every astronaut's come back with an absolutely enhanced view about the singularity and the fragility of the planet. So I'm suggesting that this next lunar mission, which happens to coincide with the end years of the current Agenda 2030 of the UN, be used to sort of hammer home the point to a enraptured world, because there'll be, again, there's a whole 2 new generations to witness what it's like to see somebody get down from a space capsule and land on the moon. That itself is not very technologically marvelous to me, but the opportunity we must not fail on using. And that's, in essence, that's what I'm going for.
Makes absolute sense. Marty?
No, I think it's trying to win everyone over. So I get what you're saying in terms of using that opportunity when you've got a focused audience, and that. But I mean, I think a lot of it also goes back to then Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You can only get certain people's attentions when they aren't focusing on basic survival, and people.
But not so basic, not so reliant on survival that you're totally consumed with, you know, you can't do anything other than eat or live. I mean, there's some sort of middle ground where knowledge and education and ability to talk and discuss and learn also need to happen. I think you might agree.
No, definitely. And I mean, I think possibly often really bad leadership within countries has taken education backwards, where populations aren't able to meaningfully add. But yeah, I don't know. I think I've sort of expressed my points, and I think I don't really have any other question. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Marty. And then I'm going to end off the evening with Andrew's last question and say thank you and goodbye. Andrew, you're the last participant for the evening.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Emily. I think you are aware what you are doing. Before you retire, you have so much to do, and especially the geological epoch that is affected by the climate change, and you need to change the minds of the people to realize that the epoch has changed, you know, and that's just my comment, because you have so much in you, you have so much that you can contribute in your life, especially in these trying times. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I would really love to tackle Carol Preston's and Isabel Human's not only questions and comments in the chat section, but I'll definitely send them, will definitely send them on to Emlyn and maybe to everyone else for that matter that attended tonight. Maybe Marek make a note of that. But I'm going to call it an evening, and then we can discuss that over emails. And I just want to end off the evening. Thank you, Emlyn, again for a fascinating journey. To start answering, or actually begin to answer the biggest question of our age. As I said, it's been an absolute honor and privilege to have you on our platform. You're part of the family now, although you live on the other side of the world. Thank you, and a heartfelt appreciation from the whole Unlocking family, Unlocking Nature family.
Thank you very much, all of you. It's been a pleasure to interact with you. Thank you.